The airport was crowded with people from every corner of the world. Travelers were rushing to catch their flights, dragging shiny suitcases behind them. Some looked tired, others looked excited, but in the middle of all the noise and movement, a simple woman named Maria stood quietly. She held a small leather handbag in her hand, the same bag she had carried for many years. Her clothes were neat but modest, a plain blue dress and a soft shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't wear expensive jewelry, nor did she carry designer luggage like most of the passengers lined up for the first-class boarding gate. Still, she walked with calm confidence, her gentle smile making her look graceful even among the crowd. When the gate opened, the airline staff began calling the passengers one by one. Businessmen in suits hurried forward, showing their priority passes. A group of wealthy women, dressed in luxury brands from head to toe, rolled their eyes at anyone who slowed them down. Behind them came tall men with watches that sparkled under the airport lights. They all looked like they belonged in first class. And then came Maria, walking slowly, holding her small boarding pass carefully between her fingers. The gate agent, a young woman with a polished uniform, looked at Maria with hesitation. She scanned the boarding pass, then glanced up at Maria again as if something didn't feel right. "Ma'am, are you sure this is your ticket?" she asked politely, though her tone carried a hint of doubt. Maria smiled warmly and nodded. "Yes, dear. That's my seat." The agent hesitated but finally waved her through. A few of the passengers waiting behind chuckled quietly. One whispered, "She must have saved for years to sit there." Another smirked, "Probably upgraded by mistake." Maria didn't pay attention to their whispers. She had heard such comments before. People often judged her by her clothes, never realizing that simplicity was her choice, not her limitation. She walked onto the plane with steady steps, her eyes calm as she entered the bright and luxurious first-class cabin. The first-class section was filled with wide leather seats that looked more like small personal rooms. Passengers were already arranging their champagne glasses, adjusting their reclining seats, and unpacking their laptops. The atmosphere carried the weight of wealth and privilege. As Maria moved down the aisle, a few passengers raised their eyebrows. They looked her up and down, from her simple dress to her plain shoes, and then back to her small handbag. She looked nothing like the people they were used to seeing in this part of the plane. A middle-aged businessman with slicked-back hair leaned toward his companion and whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "She must be lost. Maybe she belongs in economy." His friend chuckled, shaking his head. Another woman in pearls laughed softly and said, "Perhaps the airline made a mistake." Their comments spread like small ripples across the cabin, and soon a few others joined in with quiet laughter. Maria kept walking. Her seat was by the window, near the middle of the first-class cabin. She placed her small bag gently under the seat and sat down without complaint. She didn't fumble or look out of place. She simply sat quietly, as if she belonged there as much as anyone else. But the whispers around her grew louder. A young man across the aisle gave her a mocking smile. "You must be very lucky, ma'am," he said, pretending to be friendly. "First class is not for everyone." His tone made it clear what he meant. Maria just smiled back softly and replied, "Yes, it is a blessing." She turned her attention to the small book she carried, opening it with calm fingers, and began to read. The flight attendants noticed the reactions too. One of them, a tall woman with sharp features, walked over and checked Maria's ticket again. "Can I see your boarding pass, ma'am?" she asked politely but firmly. Maria handed it over with no hesitation. The attendant scanned it carefully, then returned it with a stiff smile. "Thank you. Please make yourself comfortable." But her eyes told a different story. She too wondered how this simple woman had made it here. As the other passengers settled into their seats, they ordered champagne, wine, and exotic cocktails. The attendants rushed to serve them quickly. For Maria, however, the service was slower. She didn't complain or demand attention. She simply sat quietly, her book resting in her hands, while others around her glanced her way with curiosity or disdain. The businessman who had mocked her earlier leaned back in his seat and whispered again to his friend. "She looks like she's never been in a plane before. Look at her clothes. She probably doesn't even know how to use the seat controls." His friend laughed. A woman seated a row ahead smirked and whispered to her husband, "This is why airlines should check passengers more carefully." The laughter spread again, but Maria didn't raise her head. She continued to read peacefully. Inside her heart, she felt no anger. She had lived long enough to know that people often judge what they see, without caring to know the truth. She had no desire to explain herself to them. As the plane doors closed and the crew prepared for takeoff, the whispers slowly faded. The captain's voice filled the cabin with instructions, and the engines began to roar. The passengers who had mocked Maria moments ago now adjusted their seat belts nervously, their laughter replaced with tension. Maria, on the other hand, closed her book gently and looked out the window. Her face carried a calmness that stood in contrast to the restless expressions around her. She thought of her husband, a man who had built his airline from the ground up. He was far away on business but had insisted she travel in comfort and safety. Maria smiled at the thought of him. He always told her that her heart was richer than any jewels she could wear, and that her simplicity was her strength, not her weakness. She carried his words with her now, like a shield against the judgment around her. The plane lifted into the sky, climbing higher and higher above the clouds. Some passengers tried to return to their conversations, but the memory of their laughter still lingered in the air. They had seen her as someone unworthy of the space she occupied. But Maria knew that life often had a way of surprising those who judged too quickly. For now, she remained quiet, watching the clouds drift below her, her simple presence a silent answer to the pride and arrogance that filled the cabin. Her journey had only just begun, but already the stage was set. Those who mocked her would soon learn a truth that would leave them speechless. But Maria didn't think about that now. She wasn't here to prove anyone wrong. She was here to travel, to enjoy the peace of the sky, and to carry her husband's love with her across the miles. And as the engines hummed softly, and the world below grew smaller, Maria leaned back in her seat with the same gentle smile she had worn all along. The flight had settled into a calm rhythm. The engines hummed softly, the lights in the cabin dimmed slightly, and the flight attendants moved gracefully up and down the aisles with trays of drinks. For most passengers, it was the beginning of a comfortable journey, a chance to relax, sip expensive champagne, and talk about their grand lives. But for Maria, the simple woman seated by the window, the atmosphere carried a different weight. Around her, whispers and sideways glances continued to remind her that she was seen as someone who didn't belong. A man seated across the aisle, dressed in a sharp grey suit, leaned over toward his companion. His voice was not loud, but just enough for Maria and others nearby to hear. "First class is supposed to be exclusive," he muttered. "You'd think the airline would keep it that way. Look at her. She doesn't even carry proper luggage." His companion chuckled, nodding in agreement. Both men sipped their wine with smug expressions, as though they had just made an important observation about the world. A wealthy couple seated 2 rows ahead of Maria had been observing her too. The woman wore pearls that glistened under the cabin lights, and her husband had a gold watch that caught every eye. They began speaking in exaggerated tones about their estates, their private vacation homes, and the designer stores where they shopped. Every now and then, the woman glanced over her shoulder toward Maria, her lips curving into a small, mocking smile. It was as if she wanted to prove that Maria could never compare with them. The flight attendants, who should have treated every passenger with equal respect, seemed subtly influenced by the opinions of the others. They rushed to serve champagne and appetizers to the businessmen and the wealthy couple, bowing slightly as they placed the crystal glasses on polished trays. Maria, however, sat waiting patiently. She was not offered a drink immediately. When she was finally served, it was with a forced smile, the kind that barely touched the attendant's eyes. The glass of water placed in front of her seemed plain compared to the sparkling drinks handed to everyone else. Still, Maria did not complain. She simply thanked the attendant in her soft, warm voice, and returned to reading her book. Her calmness only made the others more curious. Some of the passengers could not understand why she was so at ease in a place where they felt she clearly did not fit. The man in the grey suit leaned across again, pretending to be polite but letting his arrogance spill through. "First time flying first class, ma'am?" he asked with a smirk. His question hung in the air, filled with the assumption that Maria was out of place. Maria looked up from her book with her usual gentle smile. "No, not the first time," she replied simply. Her voice carried no anger, no defense. It was calm and clear, as if his question did not bother her at all. She returned to her book without further explanation, leaving him slightly unsettled. He had expected embarrassment, or at least a flustered answer, but instead she gave him serenity. A few rows back, another woman whispered to her neighbor, "She doesn't even look nervous. Maybe she doesn't realize how much this seat costs." They both laughed quietly, shaking their heads in disbelief. The whispers and remarks continued, like a background noise that refused to fade. But Maria had learned long ago not to let such things disturb her peace. She remembered her husband's words, how he always told her that dignity was not in clothes or jewels, but in the way a person carried themselves. And so she sat with dignity, her head slightly bent toward her book, her heart calm despite the atmosphere around her. As the flight continued, meals were served. Flight attendants rolled in silver carts filled with delicacies, fine steaks, roasted vegetables, seafood dishes, and rich desserts. The wealthy couple ordered the most expensive wine, discussing loudly how much better it tasted compared to the bottles they had at home. The businessmen spoke of profits, investments, and contracts, bragging about their achievements. Some passengers stole glances at Maria, waiting for her to look confused or surprised at the luxury of it all. But she didn't. She simply smiled when offered her meal, thanked the attendant, and ate quietly. Her behavior seemed strange to the others. How could someone so simple remain so composed in such an exclusive space? The wealthy couple grew more irritated. The woman leaned close to her husband and whispered, "She doesn't even look impressed. She probably doesn't understand the value of what she's eating." Her husband chuckled, shaking his head, and replied, "Ignorance can sometimes look like confidence." But Maria heard their words, though she chose not to react. Instead, she focused on the gentle hum of the engines and the quiet rhythm of her own thoughts. She remembered the times when her husband had told her stories about his early days, how he had once been ignored and underestimated, until his hard work and vision built the airline itself. She smiled faintly, thinking about how life often had a way of turning judgments upside down. After the meal, as the lights dimmed further, conversations grew louder among the passengers. The businessmen laughed at their own jokes, talking about luxury vacations. The wealthy couple began listing the names of designers they knew personally, making sure everyone could hear. Once again, the topic shifted toward status and belonging. The man in the grey suit spoke up, directing his words loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "You know, first class should be reserved for people who understand luxury. It loses its value when anyone can just sit here." His eyes flicked briefly toward Maria, and several passengers followed his gaze. A small ripple of laughter spread again. Maria did not look up this time. She simply kept her focus on the window, watching the endless sky outside. The soft glow of the setting sun painted the clouds with shades of gold and pink, and for her, that view was worth more than all the mocking comments around her. She found peace in the sky, in the beauty that could not be owned or controlled by anyone's wealth. Her calm silence was not weakness, it was strength. And though none of the passengers realized it, every quiet smile of hers was a silent response to their arrogance. She knew something they didn't. She carried a truth that would soon leave them shocked, a truth that made their laughter meaningless. The flight attendants noticed the tension, though they pretended not to. They too gave Maria polite but distant service, offering her less warmth than they showed to the others. One of them even walked past her without asking if she needed anything, though she stopped to check twice on the man in the grey suit. Maria simply let it go. She wasn't there to demand attention. As the hours passed and the night sky wrapped itself around the plane, Maria closed her book and rested her head gently against the seat. The whispers, the arrogance, the mocking glances, they had not broken her calmness. If anything, they had revealed more about the others than about her. They had shown how quick people were to judge, and how little they understood about true worth. What none of them knew was that every laugh, every comment, every whisper against her was being carefully noted by life itself. Soon, they would learn the truth that the woman they mocked, the one they thought didn't belong, was more connected to the airline than any of them could ever imagine. For now, Maria simply closed her eyes, letting the gentle hum of the engines lull her into peace, while the world around her continued to laugh without knowing the storm of realization waiting just ahead. The long flight stretched into the middle of the journey. The cabin lights glowed softly, casting a golden hue across the rows of wide leather seats. Most of the first-class passengers were now relaxed, enjoying the comfort of their expensive tickets. Some scrolled on tablets, others sipped their wine slowly, while a few leaned back to rest. The arrogance from earlier had not disappeared, but it had quieted down into murmurs and glances. Maria, the simple woman by the window, sat quietly, her book now closed as she gazed out at the endless night sky. The stars outside twinkled faintly above the clouds, and she found peace in watching them. Then, without warning, the plane shook. A sudden bump made several glasses rattle on their trays. Passengers looked around nervously. Another bump followed, this time stronger, causing a few gasps. The captain's voice came over the speakers, calm but firm, instructing everyone to fasten their seatbelts. The attendants moved quickly, securing loose items, their smiles now replaced by professional seriousness. Turbulence had arrived. The once confident passengers who had laughed at Maria earlier were no longer so composed. The wealthy couple who bragged about their estates clutched each other's hands tightly, fear showing in their eyes. The businessman in the grey suit, who had mocked Maria with his sharp comments, pulled his seatbelt tighter and wiped sweat from his forehead. The woman in pearls who had smiled smugly earlier now closed her eyes, whispering a nervous prayer under her breath. The turbulence grew stronger. The plane dipped slightly, then rose again. Trays rattled, a few passengers gasped louder, and the calm atmosphere of first class began to break. Attendants walked swiftly but struggled to remain steady as the plane shook again. The simple elegance of luxury was now replaced by a clear sense of fear. In the middle of all this, Maria sat calmly. Her face remained serene as she looked around at the passengers. Her hands folded gently on her lap, and her eyes carried no panic. Instead of thinking about her own fear, she noticed the young child seated with his mother a few rows behind her. The little boy clung tightly to his seat, his eyes wide with tears, as the plane jolted again. His mother tried to comfort him, but she looked frightened herself. Maria slowly unfastened her book from the seat pocket and reached for the boy with a kind smile. "Would you like to hold this, sweetheart?" she asked softly, offering the book. Her voice carried such warmth that even in the middle of turbulence, it seemed to calm the boy. He reached out timidly and held the book against his chest, his tears beginning to slow. Maria leaned slightly toward him and whispered, "Don't worry, little one. We are safe. Think of it as a small bump on the road in the sky." Her words, spoken with such steady confidence, brought comfort not only to the child but also to the nervous mother, who gave Maria a grateful nod. Some passengers nearby witnessed this and were quietly surprised. They had expected her to panic, to show fear like everyone else, but instead she was the one spreading calmness. Her kindness seemed to shine brighter in the middle of the chaos. The businessman in the grey suit noticed her calm expression and frowned, unsettled. For a moment, he forgot his arrogance and just stared at her peaceful face. The turbulence continued for several minutes. The plane shook and rattled, the overhead bins creaked, and a few gasps echoed through the cabin. Yet through it all, Maria remained still, her presence like a quiet anchor in the storm. Slowly, the turbulence began to ease. The bumps grew softer, the shaking lessened, and finally, the captain's voice returned, reassuring the passengers that the rough air was behind them. Relief spread across the cabin like a wave. People sighed, leaned back, and loosened their grips on the armrests. But even as calm returned, the memory of the turbulence lingered. The wealthy couple exchanged nervous glances, embarrassed by how frightened they had looked. The businessman wiped his forehead again, still unsettled. The woman in pearls sat silently, her earlier pride now hidden under relief. Maria, meanwhile, gently smiled at the child, who now clutched her book as though it were a treasure. "You were very brave," she told him softly. The boy smiled shyly and nodded, his mother whispering a quiet thank you to Maria. As the attendants resumed their duties, one of them approached Maria with a tray of drinks. This time, her smile was a little more genuine. "Would you like something, ma'am?" she asked with more respect than before. Maria thanked her kindly and accepted a simple glass of water. Her gratitude was sincere, as though she had been given the finest gift. The atmosphere shifted slightly. A few passengers who had mocked her earlier now avoided looking directly at her, as though ashamed of their behavior. They had seen her grace under pressure, her calmness when others panicked. Her presence had shone brighter than their arrogance, and they didn't know how to respond to that. The rest of the flight settled into quiet again. The passengers who had once bragged loudly now spoke in softer tones. The wealthy couple leaned closer together, whispering instead of showing off. The businessman in the grey suit tried to look busy with his tablet, though his eyes occasionally flicked toward Maria. She, however, paid no attention to any of them. Her focus was once again on the view outside the window, where the night sky stretched endlessly across the horizon. The child who had held her book had finally fallen asleep, his small face resting peacefully against his mother's arm. Maria felt a gentle warmth in her heart. She hadn't done much, just offered a kind word and a simple comfort, but sometimes the smallest gestures could mean the most. In that moment, Maria reflected on how quickly situations revealed the true character of people. When everything was smooth and easy, it was simple to act proud, to pretend superiority. But when the sky shook, when fear crept in, masks fell away. Then, people showed who they truly were. Some clung to fear, some grew restless, and some, like her, chose peace. Little did the passengers know that Maria's calmness came from years of experience. She had flown many times before, often by her husband's side, and had learned to trust the skies. She knew that turbulence was a natural part of flying, not a sign of doom. More than that, she carried an inner peace that came from her life values. She had no need to impress anyone, no need to prove herself. As the flight continued smoothly, the arrogance of first class seemed quieter. But the whispers had not disappeared completely. A few still exchanged doubtful glances, wondering about Maria's presence among them. They could not shake their belief that she did not belong. Yet deep inside, some were beginning to feel uneasy about their earlier behavior. They had laughed at her, judged her, and now, after witnessing her grace, they felt a strange sense of guilt. The hours passed slowly. The lights dimmed further as passengers drifted into sleep. Maria closed her eyes too, resting peacefully in her seat. She carried no anger, no resentment. For her, the journey was about reaching her destination, not about proving her worth to strangers. But fate had its own plan. The very passengers who had whispered and mocked her would soon face a revelation that would leave them speechless. Their laughter would turn into silence, their arrogance into regret. They did not know it yet, but every assumption they had made about Maria would be shattered by the truth waiting at the end of the flight. For now, she rested with a quiet heart, unaware of just how powerful her simple presence had already been. She had shown kindness where others had shown arrogance, peace where others had shown fear. And that was only the beginning. The long night began to fade into the soft light of morning. After hours of flying through the skies, the plane moved steadily toward its destination. The first-class cabin, once filled with laughter, arrogance, and mocking voices, was now quieter. Some passengers were still sleeping, their heads resting against pillows. Others were stretching, adjusting their seats, and asking for breakfast. The air smelled of coffee and warm bread as flight attendants rolled carts along the aisle, serving the morning meal. Maria sat by the window, watching the sunrise paint the sky with shades of orange and pink. Her eyes reflected peace as she sipped her tea slowly. Around her, however, the tension from the earlier hours had not completely disappeared. The wealthy couple spoke in low voices, no longer bragging as loudly as before. The businessman in the grey suit typed furiously on his tablet, trying to appear busy, but his sideways glances toward Maria revealed his lingering curiosity. It was during breakfast that the conversations began again. The topics turned toward airlines, investments, and profits. The wealthy couple led the discussion, proudly announcing how much they had invested in travel companies. "We know people on the board of directors," the woman said proudly, her pearls glistening under the soft cabin light. Her husband nodded in agreement, adding, "Airlines are all about connections. Without the right name, you can't even enter this business." The businessman joined in, smirking confidently. "Exactly. It's a game for the powerful. The rest can only dream of being part of it." His eyes briefly flicked toward Maria again, as though to remind her she did not belong to their world. Another passenger, a younger man in a suit, laughed and said, "I'm sure our simple neighbor over there doesn't know anything about such matters." He motioned toward Maria casually, the mocking tone in his voice obvious. Some laughed quietly. A few shook their heads as if amused. Maria lifted her eyes from her tea for a moment. Her calm smile remained unchanged. She did not argue, did not try to explain herself, and did not feel the need to respond to their arrogance. She simply turned her gaze back to the window, as though the rising sun was far more important than their words. But the flight attendants noticed the growing tension. One attendant in particular, a senior woman with kind eyes, walked toward Maria's seat. She held a folded piece of paper in her hands, and her steps carried a sense of hesitation. She stopped by Maria's side, leaned slightly, and spoke in a soft, respectful voice. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said gently, "your husband has sent a message for you. He asked us to make sure you are comfortable during this flight." The cabin fell silent. The name hung in the air like a bell that had just been struck. A few passengers froze with forks halfway to their mouths. Others exchanged confused looks. The wealthy couple turned their heads sharply toward Maria, their faces pale. The businessman's fingers stopped moving on his tablet. Every ear in first class seemed to tune into the conversation. Maria accepted the note with a soft thank you. Her expression remained calm as she unfolded the paper and read her husband's short message, "Hope your journey is peaceful, my love. The staff will take care of you. See you soon." Her lips curved into a small smile, one of quiet affection. She folded the note again and placed it carefully in her bag. The passengers waited in suspense, their eyes fixed on her. The woman in pearls, who had mocked Maria earlier, finally broke the silence. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she whispered, almost as if she couldn't believe it. "Rodriguez, as in?" The flight attendant nodded politely, her voice clear enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Yes. Mr. Rodriguez, her husband, owns this airline. This is his company." A wave of shock rippled through the cabin. Gasps filled the air. The same passengers who had whispered about Maria being out of place now sat speechless. Their proud faces turned pale. Their arrogant expressions melted into disbelief. The businessman who had mocked her so many times leaned back in his seat, his mouth slightly open. He didn't know what to say. The wealthy couple looked at each other, their earlier confidence gone. The younger man who had joked about Maria's simple nature dropped his fork onto his plate, the clink of metal breaking the silence. Maria, however, did not gloat. She did not turn to them with anger or pride. She simply smiled softly, her eyes calm, as though none of this mattered to her. She had not come on this flight to prove anything. She had only wanted to travel peacefully. But the truth had found its way into the open, and now the passengers had to live with the weight of their own actions. The whispers began again, but this time they carried a completely different tone. "She's the owner's wife," one man whispered in disbelief. "All this time," said another, shaking his head. "We laughed at her," murmured the woman in pearls, her voice trembling with regret. The wealthy husband who had bragged about knowing airline executives now looked down at his plate, his face burning with shame. The businessman closed his tablet and stared at the floor, his pride shattered. The younger man who had mocked her earlier avoided her eyes completely. Every passenger who had judged Maria now felt a deep heaviness in their hearts. The flight attendants, too, seemed more careful. They bowed slightly as they served her tea, their smiles now genuine and filled with respect. The senior attendant asked softly if she needed anything else, and when Maria shook her head kindly, the woman nodded with relief. Maria leaned back in her seat and took another sip of her tea. Her heart was calm. She had no anger, no resentment. She only felt a quiet understanding. People often judged too quickly, and life had its own way of teaching them lessons. Today, those lessons had unfolded in the cabin of this flight. The rest of the journey was filled with an unusual silence. Passengers who had once filled the cabin with arrogance now avoided speaking loudly. Their voices were hushed, their laughter gone. Some stared at their hands, some looked out the window, and some pretended to read. But all of them were lost in thought, replaying their earlier words and actions, feeling the sting of shame. Maria, however, did not let their guilt disturb her peace. She continued to look out at the clouds, her mind drifting to thoughts of her husband. She imagined his smile when they met again, the warmth of his voice, the comfort of his presence. That was what mattered to her, not the whispers, not the arrogance, not even the sudden respect that now surrounded her. The sun shone brighter as the plane began its descent. The announcement from the captain echoed through the cabin, reminding everyone to fasten their seatbelts. As the attendants prepared for landing, the passengers stole one last glance at Maria. They saw not a simple woman, not someone out of place, but a figure of quiet dignity, someone whose presence had turned their pride into silence. And as the plane dipped lower toward the runway, they realized the truth they had been blind to from the beginning. The woman they had laughed at, the one they thought unworthy of first class, was the wife of the very man who owned the plane they sat in, the airline they flew on, and perhaps even the comfort they enjoyed. The realization was too heavy for words. So, they sat in silence, carrying their shame like unseen luggage, while Maria remained as calm and graceful as she had been from the start. The wheels of the aircraft touched down smoothly on the runway, and a gentle cheer of relief passed through the cabin. The journey was finally over, and the passengers in first class began to gather their belongings. The soft sound of seat belts unfastening filled the air, mixed with the hum of the engines slowing down. Normally, first-class passengers would be eager to leave quickly, speaking proudly about their important meetings or expensive destinations. But today, the mood was very different. The cabin carried a heavy silence, the kind that comes when people are ashamed of themselves but cannot find the right words to say. Maria remained in her seat, calm as always. She placed her book gently into her small handbag and adjusted her shawl. Her face carried the same gentle smile she had worn from the beginning, but her silence now carried a weight that the others could feel. Around her, the very people who had mocked and whispered against her were now restless, avoiding her gaze. The businessman in the grey suit, who had spoken so loudly about power and exclusivity, sat stiffly, staring at his shoes. He had nothing left to say. The wealthy couple, who had bragged about their estates and laughed at Maria's simplicity, now whispered nervously to each other, their faces pale. The woman in pearls clutched her handbag tightly, her hands trembling slightly. The younger man who had mocked Maria's first-class experience leaned against the window, pretending to be busy with his phone, though the screen had gone black long ago. The flight attendants, on the other hand, moved with extra care. They stood straighter, their smiles genuine now, their voices filled with respect. One attendant approached Maria quietly. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said gently, "would you like to disembark first?" Maria shook her head kindly. "No, dear. Let everyone go first. I'm in no rush." Her answer surprised the attendant, who bowed her head respectfully before moving on. The passengers felt another wave of shame. They had judged her as someone desperate for luxury, someone who didn't belong, and now here she was calmly letting them leave ahead of her, without showing even a hint of pride or revenge. Her humility cut deeper than any harsh words could have. As the line formed to leave the plane, the whispers grew louder. Some passengers muttered apologies under their breath, though they were too ashamed to say them directly to Maria's face. Others sighed heavily, wishing they could undo their earlier words. Every step toward the exit felt heavier than usual. Finally, the doors of the aircraft opened, and the bright light of the terminal shone into the cabin. One by one, the first-class passengers walked out, their faces tight, their pride broken. Normally, they would have left with their heads held high, but today they left quietly, their steps slower than before. Maria waited until the cabin was almost empty. She rose gracefully from her seat, lifted her small bag, and walked calmly toward the exit. Her posture was straight, her steps light, as though she carried no burden at all. The attendants bowed slightly as she passed, their respect clear in their eyes. She smiled warmly at each of them, thanking them softly, and stepped out of the plane. In the terminal, a group of airline staff members waited near the gate. They stood in a neat line, their uniforms perfect, their faces respectful. At the center stood a tall man with salt and pepper hair, dressed in a fine suit. The moment Maria appeared, his face lit up with warmth. He walked forward quickly, his eyes filled with affection. "My love," he said softly, taking her hands in his. "Welcome back." The passengers who had left earlier stopped in their tracks when they saw this. Some had lingered nearby, curious to watch. Their jaws dropped as they realized who the man was. It was Mr. Rodriguez, the owner of the airline, the very name they had spoken of with admiration and envy during the flight. He embraced Maria gently, his voice filled with tenderness as he asked, "Was your flight comfortable? I asked the crew to take extra care of you." Maria smiled at him with calm affection. "Yes, it was peaceful," she replied softly. "Thank you." She didn't mention the whispers, the laughter, or the arrogance. She didn't speak of how she had been judged. To her, none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was being with her husband again. But the passengers nearby could not ignore it. Their shame grew heavier with every second. The wealthy couple looked at each other in disbelief. The businessman in the grey suit wiped his forehead, his earlier pride completely gone. The woman in pearls covered her face with her hand, too embarrassed to even look up. The younger man stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, wishing he could disappear. One by one, realization dawned on them, they had mocked the wife of the man who owned not just their seats, but the entire plane, the airline, and the very privilege they were so proud of. They had laughed at the wrong person. Maria, however, showed no sign of anger. She spoke softly to her husband, sharing small details about the journey, her voice filled with warmth. He listened with patience, his hand resting gently on hers. The love between them was clear to anyone watching. As they walked away together, the airline staff followed respectfully, keeping a careful distance. The passengers stood frozen, their thoughts heavy. They remembered every word they had spoken, every laugh they had shared at Maria's expense. And now, Each memory burned like fire. They had been so sure of themselves, so confident in their arrogance, yet they had been blind. Some wanted to apologize, but the words stuck in their throats. How could they explain their behavior now? What excuse could erase the way they had treated her? They watched in silence as Maria and her husband walked toward the private exit, surrounded by staff. Maria glanced back once, not with pride or revenge, but with the same gentle smile she had carried all along. Her eyes held no anger, only kindness. It was as if she was silently telling them, "I forgive you. I don't need to prove myself. Life has already shown you the truth." That smile was harder to face than any harsh words. It was a mirror that reflected their own mistakes back at them. The passengers lowered their heads, unable to meet her gaze. The story of that flight would be remembered by all who were there. They would tell it later in hushed voices, admitting how they had misjudged a woman who turned out to be the owner's wife. They would confess their embarrassment, their regret, and the powerful lesson they had learned. For Maria, however, it was just another journey. She walked beside her husband with peace in her heart, knowing that her simplicity was her greatest strength. She had no need to wear jewels or flaunt riches, for her dignity spoke louder than any luxury ever could. And so the story ended, not with anger, not with revenge, but with quiet grace. The passengers who had laughed at Maria carried their shame forever, while she carried only peace. Her presence had taught them that true worth is never seen in clothes, handbags, or jewelry. It is seen in the strength of character, the calmness in storms, and the kindness that never wavers, no matter how the world behaves. As Maria and her husband disappeared into the private lounge, the remaining passengers stood in silence, knowing their lives would never forget the lesson of that flight. The woman they thought was out of place had turned out to be the very heart of the airline itself. And in their silence, they realized something even greater, that sometimes the simplest people carry the deepest strength, and laughter built on judgment always ends in regret.